In today's episode, we'll have an intimate discussion about the feel-good home invasion film that's winning over audiences this summer. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, Senior Editor for Creative Screenwriting Magazine, and today we have with us writer-director Bryan Bertino to discuss his debut film, The Strangers. Don't forget, you could always go to www.creativescreenwriting.com to see what's in our latest issue, which you could purchase at Barnes & Nobles and Borders bookshops. Of course, we had a strange audio error that was almost spooky because for the first 30 seconds of this podcast, the audio, we had to revert to room audio because something was wrong with our main feed. But don't worry, it resolves itself. Another strange thing about today's podcast... What? No. Hey, I'm working in here right now. Nope, recording my... No, Tamara's not here. No one by that name lives here. Yes, I'm sure. Wait, I can't hear you. I'm going to open the door. Cold knife. Blood tastes like iron. Life flashing before my eyes. Never realized I ate so many corn dogs. Always remember what William Goldman said about screenwriting. The truth is that nobody really...
We always like to start with breaking-in stories. To my knowledge, you went to the University of Texas at Austin.
Yes.
All right, and you studied cinematography.
Yeah, I studied cinematography, no screenwriting or directing.
Were you in the film program?
Yeah. It's just the way the program was there. The director had to have the money, and I didn't have any money, so I didn't get to do any directing.
So the students have to be able to fund their own films. Is that what
whoever the director is, whoever's project it is, it's kind of they're the ones that fund it. And so I kind of figured out that the best way to get to work on a bunch of movies was to be the cinematographer.
Which is smart.
Yeah.
What were you shooting on mainly back in those days?
16 millimeter. Like, we were the last class of UT kids that shot just film, so it was cool.
That's cool. I mean, helpful skill if you want to be in the film industry, even though video's taken over, I know. To my knowledge, when you graduated, you started working as a gaffer. Is that right?
I worked on a lot of low-budget stuff, so if you knew how to hang a light, you became the gaffer. So most of the time I was working on really low-budget things and doing, the kind of stuff that, you were working with three-man lighting crews and stuff like that. And I started working my way up to the point where I was getting paid at least, but they were pretty small movies.
So how long was it before, like when you were working on indies and commercials and stuff like that you decided to actually pen your own screenplay?
Well, I mean, I came out here and I didn't have enough connections. I didn't have enough people to talk to. And so I was trying to struggle. I was working on these low-budget things, and nothing was happening. And so I had to take like a normal job, and I tried to do, this was like 6 months, 8 months after. I was starting to already think, this isn't working. Like, I have no way to get into as a cinematographer. I'm not even sure I want to do that anymore. So I took a job as a PA in an office, and that didn't work because I don't know how to roll calls and stuff like that or type. And so then I took a job as a PA runner and started working in editing for like about a year and a half. And while I was doing that, a friend of mine kind of, he grabbed me and he said, look, you were a good cinematographer, but really you were just a really bossy cinematographer that tried to direct all the time. So maybe you should try to do that. And so I decided, okay, but once again, I had no money. So I decided I'd start writing movies and that way I could kind of direct the movies in my head. And at least I could tell these stories. So
absolutely.
About 2 years after coming out to LA, I got on Word and kind of slowly knocked out my first screenplay.
So you started in Word.
Yeah.
Was your first screenplay this?
No.
What was it?
So I wrote that. I wrote one more, and then I wrote this.
Okay. What were the other two? Do you want to tell us what they were about?
They were
Give us titles.
Southern dramas about people being sad.
Southern Gothic, I think, is the textual.
Yeah.
Sad in the South, but it's so sunny and happy. It's interesting to see what terrifies people. Clearly, you're pretty frightened of getting engaged. That's what this movie shows. No, seriously, there's been, because a lot of critics have talked about this. We're not going to spend a lot of time reciting reviews. We'll talk about it a little later. But there's been senseless violence in films, from Psycho to In Cold Blood to Straw Dogs, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Of course, this year's Funny Games, which was a remake of another version of Funny Games by the same person. Innocent people caught in crazy people's webs. What gave you the initial story idea for The Strangers?
I mean, there were a lot of things. I mean, when I was a kid, I was going out to stay with my grandmother in this little town in West Texas, and I think the first time I ever started thinking about the concept of victims was when I was going out there. My dad said, "Hey, do you want any books?" And I said, "Yeah." And so he gave me Helter Skelter.
And you were 9, by the way.
I was very young. I was way too young for that material, but I did fall in love with it, while at the same time my grandmother used to get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and so I'd wake up and listen to this woman wander through the house, and it terrified me. But
stop. What was she doing at 4 in the morning?
She was a crazy old lady, man.
Awesome. Awesome.
No, I mean, but what I did, I realized that I was
Please put her in your next movie, by the way.
She is actually in
something
my next
about.
script.
All right, good.
No, what I realized though is that I wasn't. I read the book a few times growing up, and what grabbed me about it was not the whole Manson thing. It was the way that the book talked a lot about those murder nights, and it was so detailed, and it really put you there. And I remember thinking a lot about victims, and the fact that 20 years later I'm reading this book and I have all this extra information, but these people had none of it. And I started thinking a lot about the fact that you look at an obituary, you look at these things, you hear about murders that happen on a street or a crime, and later on we find out that, that person was a drug addict, or that person was an angry lover. But a lot of times the person that gets hit in the back of the head or shot had no idea what was going on. And so to me, what is scary is perspective. And so I felt like I'd tell a story just from the perspective of two people that had no knowledge what was going on.
It's really interesting because in the beginning of the movie, there's that creepy moment when there's a knock at the door in the middle of the night. That's kind of when it all kind of starts. To my knowledge, that kind of mirrors an incident that happened when you were a kid.
I lived on a street in a house much like this, and my parents were gone a lot. They traveled a lot, and it was often me and my sister alone. And I was 11 or 12, and she was 8 or 9. And one night, a group of people did walk down the street and start knocking on doors. And what they were looking for was whoever didn't answer the door, they kicked in the door and robbed the place. But my little sister, at 9 o'clock at night, answered the door and had a conversation with these people where they, asked some random questions and then turned and walked away. And it was only the next day that we realized what was going on. And
so, did they ask for the wrong person?
Yeah,
in the house?
They just asked for a random name, And so when I started thinking about this story and I started thinking about James and Kristen, that kind of struck me as something that was interesting, to just have some people that are knocking on doors but not looking for empty houses, but instead looking for someone to take control of.
Your original draft, to my knowledge, was entitled The Faces. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So tell us what that draft kind of resembled as you wrote it, and how long did it take you to write?
I mean, in a lot of ways, The Faces was very similar. I mean, the idea of The Faces was that I wanted the movie to be kind of a little bit about the faces of these victims, So that's kind of where that name came from. And, I wrote it I came up with the idea, I had written these Southern dramas that weren't going anywhere and nobody ever was interested in it, and they were really sad and boring. And so I started to think about, well, maybe I should try to take some of these characters or the ideas of characters that I have and place it into something that a little bit more high concept, a little bit more accessible. And so, for me, I watch a lot of dramas and a lot of foreign films, and then on weekends when I want to relax, I watch a scary movie. And so I was like, well, I'll write a horror movie. And so it came together pretty quick. And I wrote the draft over, I'd say probably about 2 months, because at that time especially, what I would do is I'd save up enough money and enough unemployment that I would have 6 to 8 to 12 weeks to write a script. And so it was okay, I'm starting and I'll be done, because I'd seen so many of my friends that were working on their great screenplay for 7 years, and it was it's not getting any better. So it was I figured I'll write this and then I'll move on to something else. But strangely enough, the story actually, the script that I wrote as a first draft that I ended up reworking a little bit kind of resembles what the final movie is. It's a very simple story that, in my mind, probably I thought I could make for $50,000 if somebody would ever give me any money.
The Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences runs the Nichols Fellowship. It's through them. It's a screenwriting fellowship. Obviously, contest, some people would call it, but I wouldn't really call it that. You ended up with this script as a quarter finalist. Is that correct? In 2006?
I can't remember if it was 2000. It might have been a little earlier, but yeah. I mean, basically.
So did they just notify you? Did you get a phone call one day?
Yeah, I mean, I entered in all my scripts. I saved up I think that was $60 a pop for each one. You send them all in, and the year before I'd been rejected, and it was, I had a few different screenwriting friends, and that's what we did. You saved up, you sent them in, and I'd actually been rejected by a bunch of companies in the past, or a bunch of festivals and contests for the 6 months previous. So I went ahead and did it because, to me, it wasn't about winning that. It was that there was a list that if you scored high enough within there, 600 out of I think like 7,000 or 8,000 that went out to agents and managers. So I placed it in there, and then I did finish. I had one of my sad ones got in the top 600, and I think this one got in the top 300.
So they called you to say, The Faces, you're a quarter finalist.
I got the letter.
You got the letter?
I got
That's
the
cool.
letter. Yeah,
that's a big deal. And so then what happened towards the road of getting this script set up?
I mean, it was pretty nuts. I mean, the everything went out. I got on the list, and, a few different managers and agents called me. I remember I was in Sacramento working on, a low-budget short, and I got a call from a guy that said he wanted to read it, and so I sent him. When I got back in town, I mailed him the script, and then went to work on a little horror movie that was shooting. And he called me back a couple of days later and said, "I really love it. I think we should meet." And so that was cool. I was "But I'm working on this job," and he was like, "Well, I think you should take the day off." And so I took the day off. I went in. Had my first meeting with a manager, and we left from that meeting to Vertigo, who ended up being one of the producers. And a week,
Roy Lee's company, and
Roy Lee, yeah,
he's a horror guy.
And that was the weekend of The Grudge coming out, so it was they were super excited, and Universal was looking for whatever they were going to do next.
The Grudge sequel, right?
No, this was, I guess, that's
because The Grudge was 03 or something.
No, I think it was 04. I think it's 04 is when all this happened. So I remember it was the weekend of The Grudge, and because I can remember the poster on the wall behind, I was thinking, okay, this is cool. They know about scary movies, so maybe they can do something. And literally from the time of that first meeting, they had a couple of notes and some spell check stuff, and then and we took it to Universal, and I ended up quitting that job that I was working on and had sold the script.
Wow. So they told you quit your job, you sold the script. Are you able to say what it sold for in those days, or was it ever published?
It was never published. It was a lot. I got to open a bank account, and so that was pretty cool.
Wow.
I was pretty excited.
Free checking. That's awesome.
You can't take large checks in, though. They won't give you the money instantly. That was the thing that kind of I was like, can I have some of the money? And they're like, no, we really need to check on this. And so I had to wait for a week. I ended up having to borrow money from friends, and I was like, no, seriously, I promise I'll pay you back. Look, I got a trade article and everything. It was nuts.
That's awesome. One of the things that's great about this is that if you're looking at how to write a low-budget horror movie, or your first type of project, you have one location, you have a low count of characters, so everything's very tangible. Were you conscious of that when you were crafting this? That this is something that could be done for the right price because this is the way I'm going to craft it to keep it low budget? I
mean, I definitely thought about that. I mean, I knew I had a few friends that were actors. I knew that I could get a house if I needed one. So that those kind of things definitely went into my head. But I personally think that horror films are a very personal thing, and so the bigger they get, then you're often. It's when I went to direct the movie, it was that was the thing I was always saying is let's put the audience in the room with the people. But if you've got this huge movie, it's a lot harder. It's I often am not standing, in the middle of downtown New York City and everybody's gone. But I have been in my house before when somebody knocks on the door. So I thought that'd be a better way to do it,
Talk about the reality. I mean, obviously it says it's inspired by true events. Was there an actual incident like this, or was it a pastiche?
I mean, honestly, it's like a lot of the things that I talked about were the inspirations. It's like kind of went into, I think, their decision that to talk about the film that way. You know, it was kind of one of those things where it's like, I think that they were looking at ways to help ground the film for an audience, and I think that it's a very effective way to bring you in. But you know, I always looked at it as in terms of, you know, I wanted James and Kristen to feel real, like you read their obituaries, because I've read those kind of obituaries. But beyond that, you know, that's kind of where it lies.
A title opens the movie that's narrated. Sounds like the guy from Law and Order. I was almost ready for the chimes in the narration. But you know, was that the way your script started, with the opening title?
It opened initially with a voiceover of a cop reading stuff, and then this eventually. There were always title cards, and then the idea just came to narrate the title cards. And I think the film feels very 70s. I mean, I was very inspired by Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, so I thought it was cool to do it. So I think it helps set a tone.
Talk about how difficult it was once, you know, obviously Vertigo was on board to get the directorship. I mean, it's not easy for a first-time director to land that first gig. Sometimes people just want your script and have you kindly move to the side.
That's exactly what
and you didn't have a body of work either, right? Because you were a cinematographer, so you didn't have like a crazy reel to show. What were the discussions like to get you on board as the director as well?
I mean, that's the thing, is that I sold the script and made no statements at all about wanting to direct. I mean, I honestly had taken no meetings where there was an office and a table. I mean, that meeting with that manager was at a coffee shop. So I was pretty terrified about the whole idea of, like, all of a sudden I'm jumping into Hollywood. So, you know, we talked, like me and my friends talked about, should you say anything about directing? Should you mention this as a goal? And I, at the end of the day, I was like, no, I need to learn about Hollywood. I need to learn what it's like to take notes, what it's like, because, I mean, that's what a writer does. You take notes. You turn in stuff, and then they tell you what's wrong with it, and then you tell them how, no, that's not true. But you still have to kind of mess around, and you have to learn that game. And I felt like it was worth it to do it. So for 2 years, you know, I went out for assignments. I took meetings. I, you know, booked jobs.
What kind of assignments? Tell us about some of the stuff you worked on.
I worked for Jerry Bruckheimer, rewriting, you know, what was kind of what they were thinking was going to be like their first horror film, which was
what was it called?
Beware the Night. And I worked on that, and that was a completely different situation where you're dealing with, you know, a $60 million, $70 million movie. But it also, like, taught me a lot about structure. It taught me a lot about, you know, how to communicate, you know.
I've always heard Bruckheimer's really into outlines and beat sheets and stuff like that. Is that true? Is that something you find yourself doing?
No, I mean, not for me, because I was rewriting, just, you know, so it's like I came in, I had to pitch my ending, I laid it all out, and I did 2 or 3 meetings. But, I mean, the biggest thing that I learned from Bruckheimer was, like, they were so great about whether or not you love Bruckheimer movies, they know exactly what their movies are. And so for me as a writer, I was able, you know, it's like you learn to collaborate like a musician or something. While someone lays down a beat, you've got to figure out how to jump in and still be heard. And so, you know, I learned a lot about that. And then the other project I worked with was a completely opposite level. Was this, I wrote an original script for Scott Rudin. And that was
Is that Green Eyes?
Yeah, that's Green Eyes.
Give us the pitch on that. Tell us, or can you?
I don't talk about Green Eyes. No, the one line pitch is, you know, it's a very simple. It's a very dark kind of take on, but character driven take on I don't know, a killer. But I mean, I don't know. It's like I had 2 different experiences with, you know, I mean, Scott Rudin has done so many amazing, like, artistic movies, and was able.
He was the producer of last year's No Country for Old Men.
I know,
he's amazing.
It was a cool story. I remember I was in there talking about Green Eyes, and they were like, "Oh man, we got this movie, we got this book, No Country for Old Men." And they were like, "Yeah, but we're giving it to the Coen Brothers." And so it's like, maybe I could have nailed that job, and also, no, I never could have, but. You know,
so what did you notice that was different about Rudin's style? Like, what was different about his notes that for Green Eyes?
I think he was just we always knew what the script was going to be, and we always knew where it was going to go. I think it was a little looser, while at the same time he gave me a little bit more freedom. I guess partly because it was an original, but he also, like, that was something where I had to write a lot of stuff. I mean, he's in New York, so that was like, instead of, you know, getting on the phone and talking for 2 hours, it was condense everything you want to say to Scott in a page and give it to him. And so it's like learning to do those kind of things, that kind of shorthand. I felt like I was building that information. So, you know, when they started looking for The Stranger, you know, when they started looking for a director for The Strangers and they weren't finding someone, you know, when they finally, for whatever reason, decided to talk to me a little bit, I felt a lot more comfortable about coming in and saying, well, this is what I think the movie would be and this is how I would do it.
What is the status of Green Eyes, just out of curiosity?
You'd have to talk to people beyond me.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'm just a lonely writer-director.
All right.
It's a big studio system.
I'll call up Scott. So what was it that nailed it for The Strangers for you to get it? Obviously, they liked your take. They knew that you wrote the script.
Well, what was cool about it is that I never, you know, I didn't go in to pitch as a director. Andrew Rona at Rogue was just, he had met with all these directors. He wasn't finding anybody he liked, and for whatever reason, he had the decision, well, let's call that writer that's been off the project for like 2.5 years and see where it initially started.
Which is genius.
And which was amazing. I didn't even think people knew those writers anymore. Like, I mean, it was, you know, this script I've said before. It was kind of like hearing about an old girlfriend that you'd broken up with in college. You hope that she's doing well, but you don't know, you know. And so, it was, you know, we got to, you know, they called me in, and what was supposed to be a 45-minute meeting turned into like a 2.5-hour meeting about like what I think horror should be and what I think this movie should be. And when I left, I got out of my car, my agents called, and they said, Andrew Rona just called us. He thinks you should direct it. And it was like, okay. And he goes, and you got 48 hours to come up with a pitch. So I drove home, stayed up for 2 straight days, you know, making copies of different things. And
was there anything you want to tell us about that was in that kind of document? The
thing that I tried to do was explain that I didn't want it to look or feel like any of the horror films that I was seeing, because I didn't really like any of the horror films I was seeing. And, you know, I mean, you know, I made pictures of, you know, I pulled still frames from Woman Under the Influence and brought that in. You know, it's like that's what I was interested in. I was, you know, practical lighting as much as possible. I wanted it to be a really warm film because, you know, I've always said it's like when I turn on the light in the middle of the night, there's not like a fluorescent tube that's sparking, like, but a horror films, that's all you ever seen. I was like, no, I turn on a 60-watt bulb and then I grab my little baseball bat and I turn and look to see what's up. So it was like, that's what I wanted the movie to feel like. And so, I mean, everything that I showed them were, you know, pictures I took in my own house of me, you know, with a knife and saying, make it look like this.
So they were terrified by the end of the meeting. That's
I'm a
good
very
stuff.
creepy guy.
Well, so when you landed it, what kind of budget and schedules did you wind up with?
I mean, the biggest thing that I asked for were days, because partly because I didn't know exactly what I was doing, so I figured those first couple of days might be a little rocky, you know. So I asked for, you know, 40 days. They gave me 35. You know, it's like, you know, I'd made a short once, a 2-minute short for $70, and they were giving me, you know, under 20, but, you know, more than $70. So I was like,
it's a huge range there, by the way. Between $70 and $20 million.
You can read about it in different places.
All right. How many cameras did you roll, being the cinematography kid?
I ended up rolling 2 cameras through most of it, which, you know, we weren't able to afford to do it throughout the whole thing. But I ended up, any day that we could afford to do it, I did it because I felt like it helped the actors just kind of be able to perform instead of me having to set up over and over and over. And so I definitely love the process.
I want to talk for a second about the villains. You know, the 3 of them. They're kind of referred to, from anything I've read, as Pinup Girl, Man in the Mask, and Dollface.
Yeah.
You know, it's odd. Like, what would you say would be kind of on the page the way you described it as any of their kind of mannerisms? Because so little of what they do is through dialogue, unlike many horror movies, that almost all of it is nonverbal. So how did you distinguish between those 3 characters on the page?
Well, I mean, I think that for me, I knew that I always wanted to cast actors for those roles as compared to just having some guy from the set or whatever. Or, it's like I knew that I thought that that it was going to be a quiet movie, and I knew that their performances would be looked at, and so I wanted them to feel very human and very real, while at the same time letting their actions and letting what we saw of them make them the monsters, as compared to the way they acted, the way they talked, the way that they behaved. And so, I think that what's great about Kip and Gemma and Laura is that they believed in those characters, and tried the best that we tried the best we could to come up with our own thoughts of what they were, whether or not that would ever be discussed with an audience.
Was there ever more to kind of exposition or backstory as to what their grudge was, why they chose this house, or who they even are?
No, honestly, it's like that was always the difficulty of the movie, is that it was something hard for, into the studio's credit, they eventually felt like, I think that there was no other way to make the movie. It's like, and when I wrote the script and then was asked, to leave for a while, like as most first screenwriters are, it's like part of that was my argument that was everything that the movie was.
Was there a period where people were rewriting you when you were gone?
I think so, but like I said, it's like the girlfriend. I think she was dating other guys.
Slut. All right, well, so, there's different pieces of information that we learn about them. Obviously, there's a line at the end where they say, it'll be easier next time, indicating this was their first time. I've killed a lot of people in home invasions. I've never been that efficient. They were pretty good. So, is that information we could glean, that this was their first outing?
I think that you can look at it that way. I think that they had some hiccups, but I look at it. I don't love the idea of a super killer, or at least I didn't think of this movie as them as super killers. It's they drove the truck that they owned, and they, like I always said, I wanted the mask to feel like you could have bought that mask at Walmart, or the man in the mask might have pulled the mask out of his back of his truck and just thrown it and tore some eyes out of it. So it's like, I think that they're, lo-fi killers in the world of things that, because I felt like that, once again, it's like I didn't want to make it so that it seemed like they had planted all these giant traps and, there were bear claws on people's heads and stuff. So,
well, actually, I was going to get to that later. What's interesting about the movie is that it's so cat and mouse that really the only time, aside from almost touching him in the car, that they really come into contact hardcore is in the last 10 minutes.
Yeah,
So was there anything ever more elaborate than just stabbing them to death? Or, was it really always just they're going to finally be done toying with them, take off their masks, and knife them?
That was always my idea. That was always what I wanted it to be. Going back...
Because it's complex, and then it just ends up so simple, which is also interesting.
Well, I think that at the end of the day, getting stabbed is enough, and so so that was always my thought on it. Is that there's a lot of cat and mouse, and I think as a filmmaker, what I was trying to point out is that, or at least I thought I would, is that sometimes that what I think is effective about cat and mouse, what I think is effective about movies, horror films from the 70s, it often left the audience to fill in the blanks on certain things, and because an audience will think it's scarier than a lot of things you're going to see on the screen. So, but as far as a final climax, I wanted to come back to something that was very rooted in something that you don't have to be in a horror movie to not want to go through what they went through,
Definitely. You had an interesting setup and payoff in which he calls his friend at the beginning. We forget about it, and then much later when they're holed up in the closet with the shotgun, the friend comes back into the house. And for a long time, you do a really good job of distracting the audience to kind of forget that they're in the closet with the shotgun. And it's interesting because as he's walking, you see the man in the mask behind him, and you never cut back. Did that look the way it was filmed on the page to kind of get the reader to forget as well that they were in the closet?
I definitely think that I wanted to stay more focused on Mike. I tried to do as much being with the perspective of whatever character you were with. It's like when Liv was left alone by herself in the house, we never shot Scott in a grocery store, getting some cigarettes. We stayed with Liv. When Liv's on the phone, we stay with Liv. It's like we stay with those characters. And so, we had a little bit of coverage of Scott and Mike, but I mean, it's funny, that scene, when you asked earlier, you said, from the time you wrote the initial draft, what scene changed the most? Well, it's like, when I wrote the original, like first time I wrote the script, that was an old man that was just walking down the road. And then I can't remember who had the note, said, something's off about that. And then I said, well, you're right. It's like it should be somebody more personal to them. Like, this is a personal story, so let's bring Mike in.
Yeah, that's a great note.
And so Mike became, that character. And, and then when we were shooting it, the biggest thing that changed is in the editing room, the editor and I came up with this idea of introducing the record player being turned on. And so that was not in the script. So the whole Mama Tried section was something that we created in the editing room, not when we shot it.
I was going to ask, was that the same record with different tracks? Because the music was always pretty creepy and amazing.
That record for sure is clearly a white record. Because I take a lot of noise for the records, but that was a white record. They purposely placed a different record on there.
Okay, so they bring your own record.
Record black. I believe I have a record collection, and if I went to stay and do something romantic for my girlfriend, I'd bring the record.
All right, so that was the record.
Records sound better than CDs.
So was it a particular record? Is it an album that has all those tracks on it? Or?
No, I mean, I think specifically there, the Strangers put that record on.
Okay.
Yeah.
And does it have a title, this record, or is it?
They put Mama Tried. They put the Merle Haggard album.
Okay, so so every track we heard was from that thereafter.
No, they played.
They played that one track.
Yes.
Okay. Well, but there was about three or four different songs.
James placed a record on at the beginning.
And which one was that? I'm just trying to get the titles of the records.
He placed Mermaid Avenue by Wilco and Billy Bragg.
Gotcha.
Which is one of my favorite albums.
Right. So he brought that.
He played that. He also brought Joanna Newsom, who's really cool, and
it was just trippy because there was different songs each time, but it worked. It worked.
There's two different times that you physically see someone put a record on, so you can imagine that they might have placed one from the thing.
Cool. I was just curious. I like the music. I was curious.
Yeah. It wasn't a magical record
because I want to make my own, killing mixtape. There's always logic issues in horror movies. Of course, the oldest is why split up.
Yeah.
How were there notes about that? What were the thoughts on that? Stay in the house. I'm going to go outside to the barn. It's definitely a moment of why would these people split up? I mean, and it's inherent in the genre.
I felt like I tried, even when I was writing the script, to address as many things that I get annoyed with. The whole idea, the birthplace of the Mike scene, or when it was initially the old man scene, was came from when I was 12 or 13 and was watching Friday the 13th and said, well, they should just get in a room and hold a gun at the door, and when Jason comes, they should shoot it. And I was like,
absolutely.
So I thought that would work. And so I liked the idea that James might have been watching those movies when I was a kid and said, no, we're going to go over here and we're going to point the gun at the door and the sun will come up or whatever.
They probably should have stayed in that room even after they killed their friend,
But but beyond that, it's as far as splitting up, it's and Scott and I and Liv and I always talked about it, is at a certain point it becomes not. I do think in horror movies, and what we at least tried to do with this one was, this is not a movie about what you wish you would have done. It was a movie about what these two people did. And, I think that, I don't know, I read a lot of stuff about people doing stupid things where you're like, why'd you get out of the car? Why did you go do this? And so, I felt like that was a moment where after he killed his best friend, and realized that he was not in the leadership role as far as what was going to happen on the night, that he thought to himself, I'm going to try something different. The only option I have a gun, I haven't seen them with a gun, I'll go out there and try to shoot them. And so that was what he thought he should try to do. Was there anything too extreme that, was cut out of your script or that was cut out of the film, either violence or something kind of in that realm? I think that it's a fine line with how much stabbing can be seen at the end, But there was no other scene of violence beforehand where they made contact with each other? No. Okay. I always felt it was more interesting outside of the tap of the finger on the back of his neck, that it was like a less is more attitude, That makes sense. Just got to bring it up because it's so absolutely funny, and there's no way you could have known this when you were writing it way back when. Obviously, you were first on it, but do you know anything about the movie Baghead that's coming out later this summer? I saw the trailer. You saw the trailer? Yeah. It's hilarious because it's people in the middle of nowhere
that want to write their own horror movie.
Yeah,
It's a group of actors, and they come up with the idea of a baghead.
Look, I mean, it's a good idea to put that on top of your head to go kill people.
Just had to bring it up. At the end, it was interesting. We're going to open it up to the crowd in a second, but the schoolboys.
Uh-huh.
They have these Christian living brochures that they're handing out. It was a very odd detail. Where did that come from? What were you going for with that?
I mean, I think that all I ever thought with the Mormon Boys.
Is that what they were, Mormons?
Well, we called them the Mormon Boys, and so they became. I think they're titled the Mormon Boys. But I mean, the idea for me was I wanted to open the movie with purity and innocence, and walk through the door with them the same way as we as an audience are walking in, not knowing what's going to happen, and then it was that concept of perspective of like when they walked in, they saw all these different details. They saw blood, they saw everything, and then at the end of the movie, they see those same things again. But we now know what those kids will never know, and so but I wanted to start with something innocent, and the Christian living kind of idea was just set that it was kind of just one more beat on that.
I had read here and there that there was a possible reshoot that was done.
No, there was no reshoot.
There was no reshoot.
No
okay, so it always ended with Liv Tyler living?
Well,
when the boys
it
came
ends
in?
with her screaming.
With her screaming? Right.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
No.
Someone had said that was a reshoot, and that she died in the original, and
no reshoots.
Glad to debunk it. Marketing for movies like this is interesting, because, as you saw, some critics out there certainly were turned off by the violence, even though there really is technically only one scene of violence in the movie.
Yeah.
At the very end, aside from him accidentally shooting his friend. Well, no, but really,
which is violence,
which is bad. Which is bad. But I mean, otherwise, it's hard for people to say that this is the most violent movie ever. Something that's not correct. What were some of the considerations you guys had while marketing it?
I mean, look, I think I tip my hat to Universal, Adam Fogelson, the guy that kind of runs the show over there, because it's a hard movie to sell in the sense of, it's just supposed to be scary. It's supposed to be terrifying, and I find that those emotions can sometimes be something I want to experience, especially, on a day-to-day life where you spend all your time trying to stay neutral. But, I think to a general audience that can be a difficulty. I mean, it's a movie that has a very unhappy ending, in a lot of ways, and so, I think that I think that part of the reason that, it took us a long time, took the movie a long time to come out is that they wanted to figure it out and they wanted to get it right. And
how long was it delayed for?
I think, from the original time it was supposed to be released, I think it was about a year,
Was there any major conversations during that time about a recut or changing it?
I mean, it
else?
was literally a year from the time that I did the final mix to when it came out. So there wasn't a lot of talk about the project at all. In a lot of ways I'd moved forward to, I never knew if it would get released or not. And so, I think everybody had their fingers crossed, but, like I said, it's like Universal did such a great job. And the day that they came forward and said, we got this trailer, we think we totally figured out how to get this out to people, it's going to change my life a little bit. So
yeah, seriously, congratulations! This opened at number 3 last weekend. It made over $20 million. Yeah.
No, it's great.
And by the way, only Sex and the City and Indiana Jones were in front of it.
Yeah.
And
they predicted 10.
Yeah, and this was the biggest. I think it's also the biggest Rogue opening ever, if I'm not.
And
correct.
the biggest Universal opening this year.
That's awesome. The year's still young.
It's very young, but I get to say it maybe once in my life. So let me have that.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. So just to go back for a second before that great news, what was your reaction like as a first-time writer-director when the reviews were coming in, very polarized and down the middle as to who liked it and who didn't, last week?
I mean, look, to be honest, to get something in New York Times, that made me feel a lot better about some of the other reviews I wasn't getting, just in the sense of you may never get a good review in New York Times again. So it's enjoy that moment. I mean, I quit reading reviews, I think, after it got to 7 on Rotten Tomatoes, and I was like, oh my God, I was living and dying. Every single one, it's like, oh my God, I suck. And then, oh wow, I'm awesome. And so I was like, and so then I said, no, quit doing it and put it down. But I think that at the end of the day, I understand why people don't like the movie if they don't like it, and I'm not saying that I'm not saying people are incorrect for not liking that there isn't a reason, not feeling like this kind of random nature violence isn't a good thing to want to watch, isn't a good thing to want to look at. I get that. For me, I feel like film can be an expression of a lot of different things, and especially with horror, I feel very strongly sometimes that, when I wake up in the middle of the night and if I thought somebody was in the living room, I don't cut to the moment where I pick up the girl and walk out into the sun. Like I say, oh my God, I hope I don't get killed. And so to me, it's okay sometimes to have those bad endings, and if people don't agree with that, I respect it.
No, seriously, congrats. You stuck to your guns. This is the film you wanted to make. You got it in the can. That's more than most people can say. So congrats on that again. Last question before we open it to the crowd. When she was running through the woods, why didn't Arwen use her elven powers to... Sorry, all right, we're going to take questions from the crowd. Had to get some Lord of the Rings in there. You, ma'am, right there in the third row. The question was in regards to her clothing changed. Why is she back in the same dress that she was seen in the beginning of the movie, even though she was not wearing it when they knocked her unconscious?
I mean, look, I think that it's pretty difficult to have her run around and do the things that she had on, and I think that in some ways, it was a conversation amongst a lot of us about, because we shot the film basically in order, which is pretty rare, and so we kind of lucked out in making the decision to do it, and then when we made the decision to do it, I started thinking about the fact that it would be cool to present them again. So, Scott had taken off his jacket and thrown it in the other room, and Liv had taken her dress off and thrown it in the other room, and I thought that there was something really kind of beautiful about finishing off that wedding that Scott had hoped would happen. So
the people put them in those clothes again.
Yeah,
obviously. Yeah. Okay, cool. Just had to make sure for that lady. You sir, right there. Do you know about the French film Them was the question, sir?
I know about it in the sense that I've been asked about it a lot, I mean, the reality of it is I wrote the script before that movie came out, and so I don't know. I mean, I've never actually seen it, though, because I kind of quit watching horror films after a while because I was scared that I would just compare them to mine and say, oh, well. Oh, cool.
You got the street cred. You ma'am. The question was in regards to, she loves your script. She'd read it years ago. There was a sequence when they escaped to a neighbor's house. She was curious what happened to that sequence.
So that was not the sequence was not in the initial spec. It was, when I sold the script, I did one set of rewrites that addressed certain notes that the studio had, then left. When I was hired back, they said, which version of the script do you want to make? I said, I want to make my original spec. And so I could have placed it back in, but once again, I liked the idea of just staying in the house.
Another question.
Wait, I want to say one more thing.
Please.
Now that I think about it, though, there were times in the editing room I kind of wished I would have shot it. Yeah, because it was a cool sequence. In retrospect, I was like, man, that was a cool scene, and I thought it was scary, and it would have given me another set piece, but I didn't shoot it. Like, I was a stubborn kid that was getting my first movie, and I was like, no, we're doing it my way. I'm going back to the spec. So, yeah.
In the back, in the hat.
I think.
Two questions. One was, what was it like to discuss with the actors, just kind of having antagonists that don't have motivations, so how your protagonists react to them is a bit more random because there's no one to reason with. It's a lot of, nonverbal, again, acting. And also, the second question was in regards to when she was getting dressed, why didn't she put on some shoes?
Well, the shoes question, I want to say, I think that she didn't think that the night would turn into a big massacre, and I think that she just assumed that her boyfriend would come back and then, and they would go to sleep or whatever. I mean, I just don't think that she thought about it. I don't think Kristen was thinking about it in terms of what the night would bring. I think that she was concerned and she felt like, I'm going to get out of this, but I don't think she ever had any plans to leave the house. As far as the initial question,
he meant the antagonist. How did you treat them since their motivation was never done?
I think that I did talk a lot to them about what I think, in some ways, a general background of who I thought they were, and it was something that I knew would never end up on screen. But I agree that I didn't want these three people to just be walking monsters. So we did spend a lot of time, and I also encouraged them to come to me with their theories on who it was. I mean, I remember sending out copies of Helter Skelter to say, like, think about being, but young and poor and not knowing what you want to do with your life and stuff like that. I wanted, I sent out music that I thought a lot of the different characters might listen to, and And then I think from there, they came in and brought in their own ideas, and we kind of crafted things that we knew would never end up on screen. But, it's like, when you look at The Man in the Mask, it's like in some ways it's like Kip and I would talk about the idea that in my head, it's like whenever I think about going to anything fancy, like I don't ever wear a jacket, but I'm going to give a speech, so I wear a jacket, So it was like, so I said to him, it's like, this is a big night for him. Maybe he would think, okay, I need to put on this old suit I have, because that's what you wear on big nights. You wear a suit. And so those kind of things were things that we developed together. And so, like, these boots are the boots that the man wore because they were my boots. And it was because, and Kip said to me his first day, he was like, I don't think I'd wear these shoes. And I was like, what kind of shoes? He's like, beat up shoes like that. And I was like, well, then you should wear these shoes. And so I gave him my shoes for the set. And so we were doing a lot of that back and forth to kind of create something that was more than just stand over here and hold the knife,
When I saw it, some journalists and I were talking about the fact that, what if it was his brother Steven, whose name is on the wall? Because, there is a point where they do open the door after it was locked. Did you ever even bother with stuff like that, or is that just silliness?
It's funny that my Steven comes because my brother's name is Steven, and I have his name tattooed. So at the last moment, I was like, my brother died, so I was like, I'm going to put Steven on there. But it's, so it's something that, like, that's a cool thing that you at least mention it, because it's like it's something for my dad, it's something for my family. But as far as those kind of elements of, like, bringing James in, I think we always knew that there was going to be a possibility that audiences especially now are so programmed to find the twist that, I know I do it, where I, like, go in and I'm just like, okay, so cool, this is all James. But, I think that what we tried to do is, in my mind, all it took was one door being unlocked, and then you're in the house. When I was a little kid, we would, like, sneak into the neighbor's house and, like, steal a Coke or something, and it was like, and people left doors
and
unlocked.
murder them, right? Seriously.
And occasionally watch them sleep, we all did it,
Absolutely. All right, another question right there, you ma'am in the middle. How influenced by studio notes and things like that were your directorial decisions during you directing the film?
I mean, it was kind of weird. They really left me alone in a way that I think had its good points and its bad points. I mean, I really was given a lot of freedom, So, for the most part, everything that we shot was the way I wanted to shoot it. And I never got... I mean, I think that they were... after the first day, they were impressed that the dailies were in focus. On the second day, they were like, wow, these are kind of pretty, and so on and so forth. I mean, I surrounded myself with people that knew a lot more about how to make movies than I did. So, I think I had a great support system. I mean, the guy that shot my movie, shot Donnie Brasco, he shot Diner, he shot Good Morning Vietnam, he shot Gangster Number One. It's like, he was able to, I was leaning on him a lot when I didn't know, okay, what do we do here? It's like my AD had worked for 20 years. So I felt like I had such a good system that, I focused in on the story, and I focused in on where I thought the camera should go and how it should look and feel, and everything else kind of came together. So, but in answer to, like, the studio, I was actually given a lot more free rein than a lot of stories I've heard about first-time directors, as far as, having, like, wiretaps program plugged into, like, heads of studios' offices, and stuff like that. It's like I was given a lot of freedom in this small town in South Carolina to do what I wanted to do.
You, sir, right here in the front row. The question is in regards to what's your thoughts about what happened in the next 6 months to these characters, some of whom would be 6 feet under.
Well, James is definitely dead. The Mormon boys are in therapy. There's a part of me that never wanted to answer that question. It's like when he said before, it's like, I don't think of it as Liv is alive at the end. I think that the last shot that we see, Liv is alive, and, as far as the strangers, I mean, I'll be honest, yeah, I do imagine that they probably did it again, but I also think that for them, it's funny. It's like the idea of, like, easier next time is going to be a completely different thing. It's like I always think about that scene in True Romance where the guy says that the first time I did it, I threw up, and now I do it just to watch their expressions change. Like, Yeah, but at the same time, you've lost the ability to love anybody else. So I'm sure a lot went through that process. But I think they probably did it again.
Hopefully they got a Nintendo Wii and they're just mellowing out. You, sir, right there. There was a Humane Society logo at the end. Were there any animals used?
No, I don't understand. I don't get it. No, we didn't have any animals in it. I tried to avoid that whole like dogs and water and little children thing, so I didn't have any of those things.
Did you know the scene where the man in the mask came up? Liv Tyler would freak people out. I would certainly.
I knew that I did no other coverage, so I felt like that's the way I wanted it to be, and I felt like in the script, even if you go back, it reads that way, like but there is no I didn't do a lot of punch-ins and stuff like that, so I ran the risk that I thought that would be a scary image, and when I was looking at the monitor, it looked pretty scary. So, yeah.
Good. You, sir, right there. Are you going to do more horror stuff?
I think that I really do. I love the genre. When I sold the script, I think I had that moment where I freaked out, where I realized that that's all that they were ever going to want to talk to me about. And I remember saying to my girlfriend at the time that I was like, I'm glad I didn't write a romantic comedy because I don't know those stories. But like for me, as I've especially now gotten, when I wrote the next script that I wrote, and when I continue to write, these are the stories that I come up with now, and I like the idea of mixing drama and horror, and I feel like The Strangers is a starting off point of where I feel like the genre could go, because I do believe there's something about the idea of, when I see a great drama, I'm emotionally exhausted. When I see a great horror film, I'm emotionally exhausted. Like I always point out, like the first time I saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre in college with a group of people. I'd seen it before I was a kid, but the movie, at the end, it's like she's just sitting in the back of the truck screaming, and then you cut to Leatherface and he's waving it, and it just cuts. And I remember being in this group of people, and nobody laughed or smiled. It was just silence. It was because you'd gone through this horrible experience with the characters. I think that there's something about mixing the two genres together, and I hope to one day make a movie that people look at and say, wow, that was an amazing drama and an amazing horror film, and the fear helped me understand their sadness, and the sadness helped me understand their fear. That's a long answer, but that's my thought on it.
That's a great answer. Right there, you, sir, against the wall. He loved the sound. It was actually good that there were no screaming cats. That's the oldest... Well, no, really, that's the oldest trick in horror, is a loud sound up for no particular reason. Anything you want to tell us about your sound design?
One of the things I love about the film is that it's as quiet as it is at a lot of different moments, where there is no score, or we just let everything play incredibly quiet. And my sound designer was Scott Hecker, who had done 300, and so he had every sound effect you could ever have, and a lot of things that we did with Scott and Tom and Andy, the composers, was about trying to use less is more, but then when we used those beats, like really punctuate them. I felt like what I wanted to be able to do so often with scary movies, it's like you hear this giant orchestra all the time that's just laying into you and telling you how to feel. But for this movie to work, I thought you need to hear the twig snap. You need to hear the floorboards creak. You need to hear Live Breathe, because that will bring us in. And so when you do have your stings, and there are definitely stings in this movie, big stings, but I felt like by going silent before that, it would bring the audience all the way there, and then you slam them. So for the most part, there's no real cheap scares. Some of you might think that they were cheap, but they weren't intended to be a cat jumping down on you. And so, yeah.
Cool. You, sir, right there. Usually in horror films, women are the victims. Here, they're two of the assailants. Was there any notes about getting away with that? Any problems?
No, I always made the point that I wanted the movie. I don't think of people. I think everybody can do something. Everybody's capable of evil. And so I think that was kind of one of the things that jumped out at me. When I wrote it in the script, I wrote it that way because I thought it was interesting, the idea that, we don't have to just be scared of a 6'5", 250-pound, man. It's like, if I get home tonight and there's a girl standing at my house with a knife, she can kill me if she wants, because I'm not ready to fight. So it was something about that will. It was something about... I wanted the evil that came from the strangers to be about the will to do it, nothing else about. Kip's not a huge guy. None of the strangers are physically imposing, but it's the fact that they're willing to do it. I mean, Pinup Girl is a very small person, but when she stands up with a knife in front of you, it's a frightening thing.
Why did they take off their masks at the end?
I think they were done being monsters.
Just curious. No.
Yeah.
All right. One last question. You, ma'am, right there. Did you storyboard, and also were Scott Speedman and Liv Tyler your first acting choices?
We definitely storyboarded. I mean, I think that initially the studio really wanted to see what my kind of shots look like, but then I kind of also got obsessed with the idea of storyboarding as much as possible. But what I kind of discovered after about the first 10 days is that they definitely became guides. Part of it was in the first 10 days stuff wouldn't work, and so then I had to think on the fly. But then by 10 days in, storyboarding became something that often it was me doing with a pencil on the back as a reference form. We shot listed as well, but once again, I mean, I think that it became much more free and open, and especially with working with Scott and Liv. I mean, horror is an interesting thing in that you do have to do certain things to be able to build the moments and coverage later on. But what I tried to do is find as much where we could shoot it as naturally as possible, segue into the traditional, you need a POV of the door. Now you need, a tracking, We tried to do as much of that, but I think that a lot of it came down to the fact that I got more comfortable with the process and I no longer needed the boards always. And when something wasn't working, one of the highlights for me were when I looked at the scenes that weren't working and created on the fly to say, no, these boards that we created 6 weeks earlier are stupid. Let's do it like this, and this. And when it actually works and there's moments on screen that it does, I was like, wow, I actually kind of learned how to direct, I think. As far as Liv and Scott, I think I knew when Liv was interested in doing it that I definitely wanted to take a meeting with her because I felt like she had all of the things that I was looking for. I liked the fact that, she's an incredibly beautiful woman, but very real. And I liked the fact that she was, she just reminded me, I told her, it's like she reminded me of the most beautiful woman that would work in your office, which, but I meant that in the ultimate compliment because I wanted it to be real. And Liv is so accessible when you hang out with her that, it brought that quality home. As far as Scott, I mean, I hadn't been real familiar with Scott's work, and, I wasn't a Felicity fan, so I didn't know. But then I went back and watched a movie with Sarah Polley that he was in that I got really excited, and then he auditioned, and I really started to get interested in him, and then, we ended up sitting down and meeting a couple of times, and then finally the three of us went to dinner, and within 15 minutes I knew that this was perfect. And what's funny is that I hadn't worked with Scott, or I wasn't familiar with Scott's work before, but I think Scott's one of my favorite actors now, and would think of both of them, for anything again, because I think Scott brought it's a difficult role to not be able to save the day, but yet figure out a way to at least come across like you're doing everything you can. And especially when I give him lines like, that he lied about hunting when he was a kid, it's like, but I think that was Scott really dove into the idea of this movie's not he wasn't trying to do what he wished he would do. And I think he believed in that kind of character. So I was so lucky. You're in the house for 35 days with two people. Like, they got along with me. Like, that's the best thing you can have. And the performances in a lot of ways are the thing that I'm most proud of because it was the thing that I had the least amount of knowledge about as far as directing actors.
Speaking of which, what was your toughest day on set and how'd you get through it? Like the logistically toughest day when you're like, man, it sure sucks to be the writer-director right now, but I've got to pull it off.
I mean, the last couple of days in the movie were these like 18, 19, 20-hour days where you got to get everything, but the hardest day for me, I think, was day 3, and I'd mentioned it was the day that the storyboarding broke down, and I was standing in front of, 60 people that are just kind of watching me stand around, walk back and forth and think about it, and then have Liv and Scott rehearse, and an AD tapping her watch and being like, we're 45 behind, just so you know, we're 2 hours to lunch, and it's like, shut up for a second. And then and at that moment thinking, oh my, like at that point the plan had broken down, and I was afraid that the wheels were coming off.
So how'd you get out of it? How'd you fix it?
You just talk through it, and you figure out what the heart of the scene was, and then I watched Liv and Scott do it, and then just made a decision. Okay, we're putting the camera here, and let's go forward, and it worked. And it ended up being in the movie. It ends up looking good, and so. But that was the moment where I thought, I'm going to fail, and they're going to fire me, and it didn't happen. So that meant more. And so as the days got harder, I had more confidence in myself, and it made it easier to deal with it. Then it just became about, man, that sucks that it rained when we were shooting. It rained when we were shooting the scene where he carries her outside, and so we had to cut 8 shots and instead shoot 2 close-ups in a medium. So it's like. But you learn to deal with it because you start to see the movie and you trust your instincts.
I hope that some of your sad Southern dramas make it to the screen. I can't wait to see what you do next. Give it up for Bryan.
Thank you.